backgrounds to Christianity, and today we are going to talk about the canon and the Bible, um, and what those are and where they come from, and what and how they may or may not be different. So one thing that I didn't put at the beginning of this slide deck is that at the end, I'm going to talk for a while, and then at the end there is going to be like some discussion, and it would be really good if while you're listening, I recommend taking notes because there's a lot of information, but just be thinking about like a question or some like just something to share at the end, whether it's a question or a piece of input or something like that. That won't be on the recording. Like I'll turn off the recording before we discuss, but if something occurs to you, just kind of take mental note of it or jot it down, because there will be a time for that at the end. So
cool. Oh, speaking of end, are we doing this for half an hour and a half?
I think an hour. That's what I sort of budgeted for it. I think if I've got it timed right, so we'll see. Okay, so the canon. It's not really possible to understand Christianity without really understanding the traditional Christian view of the Bible, which is as the canon of Christian belief. And the word canon comes from Greek. It's a noun, and it means a rule or a standard of measurement against which you check other things. So the example that you might see in the modern day would be this. This is an example of a canon. Either you measure up to the line or you don't. And it's the same word as like Pachelbel's canon, which is like a canon in a musical form, is a piece of music that starts with a sort of musical phrase that acts as the rule or standard against which the initial theme is repeated with variations. So the Bible is the standard of measurement that Orthodox Christianity uses to determine whether something, whether it's a teaching or a book or whatever, is true, accurate, or acceptable. We, in the modern day, will usually use the word, like the phrase, the canon, to refer to the Bible, or like the sort of like closed body of scripture. But even that differs based on who you ask. So in Judaism, the canon refers to the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, which is shortened to the acronym Tanakh. And that means instruction. That's Torah. That's the first 5 books of the Bible, or the Pentateuch, the prophets, and the law. Catholic and Orthodox and the Coptic churches have the Old Testament, the New Testament, and a group of deuterocanonical books, which vary based on what church you're talking about. And then deuterocanonical just literally means a secondary canon. So it's a canon, but of secondary importance to the primary canon of scripture. And then Protestants have the Old Testament and New Testament. So we'll take the overview of the Old Testament first. Testament, in this context, is a legal term that specifically literally means the outline, like a document that outlines a covenant or an agreement between at least 2 parties. And we're talking here about God and his people, originally God and the Jewish people, and then the Gentiles were brought into the covenant in the second covenant. So this is why we call it the Old Testament. It can also mean Old Covenant. They're like literally interchangeable words. We do have the same source texts for the Christian Old Testament and the Tanakh, but they are organized differently, as you can see here in this slightly complicated chart. So it's all the same books, but in the Jewish Bible, a number of the books are condensed into one that we split up. So like First and Second Chronicles is one book. The prophets are all one book. Whereas we kind of chunk them all up, and we also arrange them differently, which was done to reflect kind of different ideas about what's important and what is the point of the story. So the Jewish Bible ends with the end of Second Chronicles, which is sort of everybody returning from exile in Babylon and going back to build the second temple, whereas the Christian Old Testament ends with the book of Malachi, where, God sort of promises that he is going to send a new witness, and he's going to send Elijah to bring good news back to his people. The Jewish canon, and this is important because, we want to look at where these books came from, right? So the books in the Old Testament or in the Tanakh were collected starting around the Second Temple period, largely because so many books were lost at that time. And people were really, really worried that the rest of the things that hadn't already been destroyed during the Babylonian exile were going to be destroyed if they didn't really make an effort to collect and categorize them. So this period, starting around 516 BC, and kind of ending with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, people were working very hard to collect any books that were recognized as being divinely inspired. And they were translated into Greek and distributed very widely in a book called the Septuagint. This is the version of the Bible that most people were reading at the time of Jesus, which includes the Canon, Tanakh, plus the Jewish Apocrypha, which is like the Maccabees and a couple other books. We can see that as early as 300 BC, and we know this because we found it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are, all of these books were already part of the Bible at that time. So they're very well accepted from a very early point. And to early Christians, the Tanakh just was the Bible. And we know this not only because it was the Jewish tradition, but every time that Jesus is referring to the law and the prophets, and he also refers to the writings and the Psalms, this is what he's talking about. He's referring to the Septuagint, and the New Testament directly quotes the Septuagint almost 300 times, which is pretty impressive. It's like a lot of quotes, which is, so when we're talking about how do things become accepted as canon according to the Christian church, the referring to one book of the Bible referring to other books of the Bible is a very important part of that. So we have strong evidence that the Jewish New Testament was always received by the church as canon from the very beginning of the history of the church. So the New Testament, second half of the Bible, is named after the verse in Jeremiah 31:31, where God promises to make a new covenant. And he goes on to say, I will write my law in the hearts of the people, and everybody will sort of know God in a personal way. And that is, of course, the message of the New Testament. Consists of 5 biographical books, 21 letters, and the Revelation of John, for a total of 27 books. And there are a ton of things that people just say about the New Testament, which modern historical research really doesn't support, and neither does the text. But I hear these things all the time. So from the perspective of either, are you somebody who doesn't know a lot about the Bible yet and are trying to figure out what's true about it or not, or from the perspective of apologetics and saying, I talk to other people about the Bible, and these are the things that people are telling me all the time, and I don't really know what's up. These are some of the things that we hear very commonly that we're going to be addressing in the next couple slides. One is that the writers of the New Testament were writing a memoir, but didn't really have any idea that what they were writing was going to become the Bible. And maybe if they had known that, they would have said some things differently. And this wasn't as though somehow this all just sort of happened, and they had no concept that their writings were going to be received this way. That is a misconception. It is a misconception that the canon of the New Testament was contested for hundreds, that people were arguing over what books should be in and what books should be in, not in. And that it was that nobody had any idea what was from God and what wasn't, kind of at large. The idea that we cannot date the New Testament any closer than a couple hundred years after the life of Jesus is a misconception, which we're going to look at. This one isn't quite as much in the slides, but we can talk about it at the end if people are curious. The idea that there's no evidence that the writers of the Gospels are actually tied to the gospel. Like, this is a really popular one right now. It's like, well, we have no idea who actually wrote this. Like, obviously it's not the people it was named after. Like, that's impossible. There are some strong arguments as to why it's very possible. Another misconception is that everybody accepted like all of the apocryphal books that are no longer in the Bible, and that they were sort of like shoved out by an ecumenical council. That's not what happened. So, what did happen? How was the New Testament canon established? We're going to go over a timeline, and it's mostly chronological. Some of it jumps around a little bit. But the earliest book in the Bible, as far as we can tell, is First Thessalonians. And when I say early, we're talking about like 15 years after the crucifixion. And the way we can date that basically has to do with the dating of other books and references to the existence of First Thessalonians. What Paul is referring to and how other people are referring to Paul elsewhere. Like, pretty sure that First Thessalonians is the first letter that he wrote, and based on the timeline of where he was and when and what else he wrote, we're pretty sure of the dating here. And in First Thessalonians, Paul is very clear that he views this as the word of God. So this idea that like, oh, nobody has any idea that this is going to be the Bible. No. Paul very clearly says, like, it's good that you're receiving this as being the word of God, which it is. At that time, like in his letters, several of his letters, including First Corinthians, I think Ephesians, there's a couple places, Paul uses this phrase where he talks about, I have transmitted to you, or I have given to you what I first received. And there's some really interesting scholarship about this that indicates, you can kind of see in the Greek that when Paul says that, in the Greek text, it's essentially like, it's very recognizable, like in the way it's formatted, that Paul is quoting. The sort of the use of language changes, the vocabulary changes, the syntax changes. So this is thought to be Paul quoting creeds of the early church that were sort of put together before the written Bible. And we can date these to as early as around 38 AD. And that's even like the very liberal scholarship that tends to want to say, like push dates forward. Even like some of the most liberal textual critics are now kind of looking at this dating for those creeds, which is significant because now we're talking about, these are strong theological statements that Paul's making here within 3 years or so of the crucifixion, which is important because we're kind of, we're looking at this idea, right? Did the ideas of the Bible really take hundreds of years to develop? Well, maybe not, actually. The finalization of the written Gospels started around 70 AD, but we know that they existed in partial written and oral form before that point. And the tradition of eyewitness report goes back as far as the existence of the books themselves. So typically, when you're dealing with ancient texts where people are talking about like a biographical or historical text with anonymous authorship, it's very, very common that you see those texts with tons and tons of different names and different attributions. And we just don't see that. There is no historical record of any of the Gospels ever being associated with a different writer, even to the very earliest copies that we have, which go very far back, which suggests that everybody knew from the very beginning, like, who these were attributed to. And there's just some interesting arguments about that. We also have letters and descriptions of the early church from various church fathers and theologians who indicate, among other things, the epistles of Paul had already been gathered into a written book collection as early as about 80 to 85 AD. And by no later than 110 AD, we have the book of Second Peter, where Peter endorses Paul's writings to be received as scripture very specifically. Like he uses the word scripture to refer to the letters of Paul. And that's, so 110 AD is actually the latest completion date that we have for any book in the New Testament. So essentially, our first sort of phase of our timeline here is that by 110 AD, so we're, 80 some years from the crucifixion, and we already have basically the entire New Testament is written and being circulated and well recognized as to its like apostolic provenance, like who wrote it, how are they connected to Jesus, are they an eyewitness, etc. Like this is well received already at this point. Justin Martyr, who was one of the very early church fathers, has a description that he wrote in a letter where he records visiting a Christian church service in the 2nd century. And there he's already talking about the fact that the memoirs of the apostles, which means the Gospels and the book of Acts, are being read in the church service as scripture. Everybody's got copies of them. They're being sent around. The debate actually about, well, what should and shouldn't be in the canon didn't start until about the year 144 AD, which was because of a guy called Marcion, who basically decided that nothing should be in the Bible except for the writings of Paul and about half of the book of Luke. And he actually taught that the God of the New Testament was a completely different God from the Jewish God, and that the entire Old Testament and most of the non-Pauline books should be totally rejected by Christians. And Marcionism was very popular for about 200 years. And a lot of it spurred a lot of argument about like, well, should we receive these books? Should we not? On what basis? And they actually also eventually almost led to the letters of Paul being rejected from the Bible because people were so concerned about kind of supporting the Marcionist arguments that they were like, maybe we should just not allow like Paul's writings into the canon. But they were so widely confirmed and accepted as being of spiritual value that they were brought in. But that is actually why the letters of Paul come after the Gospels, even though they were written beforehand. It is specifically to send a message about the relative importance of Paul and his writings compared to the Gospels. By 170 AD, there is a document that exists called the Muratorian Canon. And it is just a list that somebody wrote down of the books of the Bible. And at that point, we've got 20 of the New Testament books that we...
Hey, again.
Yeah, you're going the right way.
Yeah.
Hey, Jen, can you mute your phone?
Oh, apologies.
No problem. So by 170 AD, we've got this list, right? We've got like one copy of it, and the little bit of the top of the paper is missing, but we can see the 4 Gospels are on there. 23 of the books that are in the finalized New Testament are listed as basically saying every single church everywhere accepts these books. There's nobody who doesn't accept these books as part of the canon. And then the remaining 5 books that we have today are listed as being in use, but some people aren't sure. That includes the book of Revelation, Hebrews, Jude, and there's 2 others, like 2 of the smaller epistles. And then a long list of books that they're like, nobody accepts these. These books are crazy. So we're at 170 AD. We have a written canon at this point and a widespread tradition throughout Asia Minor of everybody using these books. Because of the debate that was happening because of Marcion, the Gnostic heretics, and as the apostles and the eyewitnesses to the events of the first century started to die, there was a huge number of people started to kind of write their own version of the story. As it became more and more possible to sort of say whatever you say and not worry that a witness is going to call you out for being like, I was there and that never happened. So people started to say, well, like, we really need to develop some criteria about how we're going to know which books should be in and which books should be out. It's getting very confusing. The market is being flooded with these, like, you know, the gospel of this guy and the apocalypse of that guy. Nobody knows what to do. So the church fathers, working together, developed 4 criteria that we still use today to assess the sort of canonical nature of a book, whether it should be accepted or should be not. So this is a quote. I thought this was really interesting. This is from the University of Oxford, published a paper on the criteria by which the early church fixed the canon. The Christian church did not define or impose the list of New Testament books according to its will, but rather it recognized the authority that they already had in various Christian communities from apostolic times. So what does that mean? The point is that when the church determined this is the canon, this is in the canon, this is not in the canon, this meets the standard, this doesn't meet the standard, a big thing that they were doing was looking at what had already been accepted universally among the members of the church. So the 4 standards that we look at are apostolicity, which is a hard word to say, orthodoxy, Catholicity, and spirituality. So apostolicity means, was the book written by an apostle or a close associate of an apostle? So we, you know, of the 4 gospels, for instance, 2 of them were written by apostles, 2 of them were written by, you know, at the very least, a close associate, if not an apostle. There's some debate as to whether, you know, was Luke an apostle or not. Same thing with the epistles. Like, was Jude an apostle? Who knows? But we're like, who wrote the book of Hebrews? Nobody's totally sure, but it's very clear from the text that it was, if not Paul, a close associate, somebody who was like well acquainted with this circle, and we can trace it back to the 1st century with pretty clear provenance, I guess. Orthodoxy. This means it doesn't contradict the Old Testament. It doesn't contradict the apostolic tradition, meaning in this case, the sort of oral tradition of the church, or, you know, when there were still living apostles. This would mean, like, it doesn't, you know, like, the apostles aren't here saying this is wrong. And it does not contradict any of the already accepted New Testament books. Catholicity refers here to universal usage, and it literally just means everywhere you go, like, when you bring this book into the church, people read it and are like, yep, that sounds right to me, and want to use it and accept it and find it relevant. And then finally, spirituality literally just, does there appear to be spiritual power and impact from this document? And if a piece of writing does not meet all 4 of these criteria, it is not considered to meet the standard of canonical inclusion. So going back to our timeline, in the early 300s AD, a priest named Arius, who was very popular, began teaching that Jesus was a created being rather than a co-equal member of the Trinity. This gets into, like, weird theology that we are going to talk about in a later class. Right now, all that's really important for today is just to know that this was not a common teaching. It was kind of a new idea, and people were very interested in it because it was new. So up until this point, nobody had really been saying this, and it caused a really big stir, and people were not sure how to handle it. Because of that, because there was so much controversy over it, Emperor Constantine I convened the First Ecumenical Council. Ecumenical just means worldwide. So this is in 325 AD, and Constantine reached out to bishops from everywhere in the known world to invite them to the city of Nicaea so that they could hear arguments from both sides. Arius himself attended this council and was able to present his position, answer questions, you know, and there was pretty rigorous debate about it at the time. The result was nearly unanimous. Arius, and I believe it was Origen, one other person, voted that Arianism should be allowed, and 316 other bishops voted to reject the teachings as heresy due to the fact that they could not meet the already existing standard of the canon. Why is this important? Well, this is when the Nicene Creed was written. And it is also kind of where people date a closing of the Christian canon, which means the point at which nobody was really interested in allowing any more debate as to what should be in and what should be out. And the Nicene Creed was written on purpose during this council in order to create a sort of a brief summary of what the church has agreed is orthodox or true by checking it against the canon, which already existed. So the Nicene Creed was signed and received by all attendees of the Council of Nicaea, except for Arius, and again, I want to say it was Origen, who were banished, not allowed to come back or participate as bishops in the church anymore from this point. So at this point, the canon has now closed. There's no more books out there that people are looking for, you know, and it goes back all the way back to, you know, from about 38 AD up until now about 325 AD. We've seen the same books the whole time, but this is the point where everybody's like, all right, we can just stop discussing it. There are a lot of misconceptions about what happened at the Council of Nicaea. You'll hear a lot of people talk about the idea that, like, oh, well, the Council of Nicaea are the people who decided what should be in the Bible and what shouldn't be in the Bible. No, that is not what happened at all. That's not what the council was about. It was sort of a sideline to this other argument about Arius. So where did that idea come from? Throughout the coming weeks, occasionally we're going to talk about some myths and weird ideas that have come into pop culture about the Bible and church history, and this is one of them. So in the 9th century, a book called the Synodicon Vetus was written, and it is a history of church meetings, basically. And so when it's talking about, oh, what happened at the Council of Nicaea, mind you, this is like 5 to 600 years after the council. We're not totally sure the date of the book. Basically says, well, they were arguing about which books should be in the canon and which books should not be in the canon. And so they stacked them all up in a big pile. And then miraculously, God caused some of the books to fall on the ground. And some of the books didn't fall. And that's how we knew which books should be in the canon and which books should not be in the canon. And the Council of Nicaea decided in this way what the Bible should be. Voltaire takes this idea and puts it into his philosophical dictionary, which he wrote in the 18th century. And then in the 20th century, Dan Brown, having read Voltaire and probably knowing Dan Brown, the Synodicon Vetus, brings this idea into the Da Vinci Code, makes it like a major plot point that, you know, oh, there's this sort of shadowy group of people who rejected spiritual books that up until now everybody had been reading and everybody had understood as valid or important, but because they didn't fit like the sort of narrative of power, like these guys cut them out of the Bible. That there is zero historical evidence for that. You know, the Muratorian canon, like a lot of the books that Da Vinci Code talks about, the Muratorian canon back in 170 AD had already listed those specific books as like absolutely not okay, if they had even been written yet, many of which hadn't been written yet. But there's a lot of confusion about this because there is the Apocrypha, which is the deuterocanonical books, which again, deuterocanonical means secondary canon. These are accepted by the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and the Coptic Church. All use, they each have their own version of the Apocrypha. They don't all have the exact same lists. Judith, Tobit, Maccabees, and Susanna, I think, are in all of them, but then there's some others where they vary. That is not the same as the pseudepigrapha. The pseudepigrapha literally means false writings, and every single sect of Christianity recognizes these as heretical documents. Now, this is including like the infancy gospels. So any of the gospels that talk about like, oh, like here are the miracles that Jesus did when he was a little kid. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Peter, the Acts of Thomas, the Acts of Peter. There's tons of them, and they are all universally rejected. But some people, including Dan Brown, refer to books from the pseudepigrapha as being part of the Apocrypha. And it gets very confusing and weird. That's not historically correct. One example of modern day pseudepigrapha would be the Book of Mormon and Pearl of Great Price, which is another part of the Mormon scriptures, which basically represent themselves as being canonical, but cannot meet the standards of canonicity that we already discussed, which is why they're rejected by the mainstream Christian church, mostly on the basis of the fact that they are unable to meet the standard of apostolicity. So that's sort of how we get to where we are today. At this point, what we're dealing with is the canon that's been closed since, between 300 and 400 AD, and we read it in translation. So the sort of last thing I want to talk about with the canon for today is the questions about translation, because this is the other thing that comes up a lot. It's like, well, how do we know this is so old? How do we know if we have like the really right thing? How do we know if it's really true? How do we know if it's translated right? How do we know which translation is okay and which one isn't? So we've already talked about the fact that for the Old Testament, the early church was using the Septuagint, and they were reading in Greek, and they were writing also in Greek. It was the most widespread language of the day, the one most likely to be read and understood because it was the language of commerce. So if you were trading, and trade routes were a major venue for the spread of Christianity throughout Asia Minor. So if you wanted to do trade, you probably spoke Greek. So all of these books were written in Greek, occasionally in Aramaic, which is a Syrian language, because Syria was one of the kind of hubs of the early Christian church. So the Bible was translated fully into Syriac, which is an Aramaic dialect, by the 2nd century. And we have copies of that. So we have copies of the Syriac Bible going back to the 2nd century. As of today, there are over 25,000 handwritten copies of the New Testament, mostly partial copies, that currently exist that we know of. These are in Coptic, Syriac, Gothic, Arabic, and Greek. And in addition to that, the early church writings, like the church fathers and early theologians, quoted the New Testament so extensively that you could recreate the entire New Testament almost completely just from their letters, even if every single extant copy of the New Testament were destroyed. The earliest handwritten fragment that we have dates to 100 AD, so 20 years after it was first written down. So this goes extremely close to the originals, closer to the original autograph than I want to say any other kind of ancient text that we have from the same era. I didn't put that in here, but I have a note about it somewhere. Out of these 25,000 copies, right? So how accurate are they is an important question, right? Because if one copy varies very widely from another copy, it doesn't really matter that we have a ton of them. So it's an important question, right? So only 1% of the text. There are, you'll see transcription errors. They're very obvious. They're like spelling mistakes. It's easy to recognize like a typo when you speak ancient Greek. of these 25,000 copies of the total text, out of all of these copies, there are 3 verses where the words differ from each other enough that it's hard to know exactly what the original meaning is supposed to say. There's like, I mean, they're all still pretty close, but there's like 3 or 4 different ways that it could be translated that are all sort of equally acceptable. None of these contain major doctrinal statements. And according to one Greek scholar, Wenger is his name, the verbal agreement in these differing manuscripts in the original language is closer to each other. So the Greek disagreement, it's closer to each other than the variation between different English translations. So we're talking about 3 verses out of the entire Bible are different enough that we can't be 100% sure of what the original intent was, which is pretty incredible when you're talking about 25,000 handwritten copies of a book that was written 2,000 years ago. Modern Bible translations rely on a combination of all of these early documents, looking at the original Koine Greek and Aramaic, translated by a group of scholars together, and then subject to extensive peer review before they are published. So most reputable Bible translations use a team of multiple translators, and will often have, you'll have a group of people will be working independently on the same verse, and then kind of coming together as a committee and looking at, well, what did you get when you did this? Like what, and kind of working out together, like how to get to the most accurate modern interpretation of the language. There are a ton of translations out there. They don't all take the same approach. So it's important to know, there's different ways that people look at the idea of translation and how translation should be done. So the kind of there's about 4 or 5 sort of major ways that people approach this. The first is what's called dynamic equivalence. And this means a sense for sense translation. So a sense for sense translation would be like, well, we're looking at whole phrases or idioms or sentences, and we're trying to convey the meaning of this group of words. So even if it's not exactly word for word, like it's looking at like, what was this definitely meant to mean, and how can we get to that as closely as possible in the modern language? Some examples of this are the Amplified Bible, the Jerusalem Bible, the English Revised Version, the New International Reader's Version, and the Complete Jewish Bible. Formal equivalence translations are literally word for word as much as possible. Sometimes they can be more difficult to read because they don't have the same focus on readability that you get with sense for sense. And they'll sometimes translate things without really looking at like, well, does this idiom make sense in English or like whatever? But people who are interested in scholarly reading tend to prefer a formal equivalence translation because they want to know exactly what the words are as much as possible. So the King James Bible is a good example of this type of translation, although the source texts for the King James Bible are not as old, and it sometimes it translated from translations, whereas these other like Young's Literal Bible, the New American Standard, the ESV, and the Modern English Version use kind of better source texts and much more modern language, but the King James Bible was kind of one of the first attempts at doing a literal word-for-word translation. Optimal equivalence tries to get the best of both worlds. So they do word for word wherever possible, and then sense for sense where it makes it easier to read. The NIV is a really good example of this. The Holman Bible, the Common English Bible, and the Modern Language Bible all do this. And then there are what's called idiomatic or paraphrastic versions. I don't think it is really accurate to refer to these as a translation. They often are written by paraphrasing an existing English translation rather than going back to the original language. and they tend to use a lot of the translator's own words and also the translator's own interpretation of what it should mean or what it was supposed to mean. And they run a risk. They tend to be very readable, but they run a risk of losing a lot of your original nuance and context from like the original because you're sort of locking in an interpretation when you paraphrase. The Message, the Voice, the Passion Translation, the Street Bible are kind of the major ones that do this. And then finally, there are some denominationally affiliated versions of the Bible, which can be problematic because these are published by specific churches or sects, and they don't usually use the same kind of peer review or academic oversight. When they've been reviewed by scholars, they're often called out for having issues with like not meeting the standards of kind of academic translation. People have found additions or deletions from the text where like the English says things that just don't exist in the original Greek, that usually are reinforcing the theology of the group that published them. So I always recommend people be careful about reading any of these. A few examples would be the New World Bible, the Recovery version, and the Tree of Life version are all just a little bit, because they were published by groups with an agenda. It's not like with a, I mean, you could argue that every Bible is published by somebody with an agenda in the sense that they think that their version of the Bible is the best Bible. But in this case, these are people who are trying to get you to join their group and follow their version of Christianity. So I'm always a little bit like, I don't know about that. So that's just sort of our summary of what we have today in the modern Bible. We have these approaches to the original text. So that is, let's see how we did on time. Oh, timed that almost perfectly.
Good.
So I'm going to stop the share. Oops.